It was an unusually quiet Thursday morning in the town of Elmridge, where life moved slow and steady like the ticking hands of the old clock at Morrison's Calf, the far edge of the town where rust met grease and the scent of oil clung. To the air like perfume to memory stood a modest garage Tony's Auto Works. Tony wasn't just a mechanic. He was the kind of man who greeted strangers with warmth, never overcharged a single customer, and believed that kindness wasn't weakness, it was principle. He had a reputation built over decades, not for how quickly he fixed engines, but for how deeply he understood people. One scorching summer afternoon, while Tony was wiping the sweat from his brow and tightening the bolts of a battered pickup, the bell above his garage door chimed. Moments later, the roar of a sputtering engine outside made him look up. Sleek black car rolled to a hissing stop right in front of the entrance, smoke curling from under its hood like a distressed spirit. From behind the tinted window emerged a woman late 20s, stylish yet not flashy, clearly someone who didn't belong in Elmridge. She looked worried, frustrated, and slightly out of breath. Tony, wiping his hands on an old rag, approached her with a gentle smile. Engine overheating, he guessed. Smells like it's been crying for a while. The woman nodded, biting her lip. I think so. I'm not really sure. I was on my way through town and suddenly smoke everywhere. I pulled over as soon as I could. Tony nodded, gesturing for her to step back as he popped the hood. The engine was indeed miscoolant leaking, belt strained. It was going to take a few hours at least. You're not from around here, are you? He asked, casually inspecting the damage. No, she replied. Just passing through. I'm headed somewhere important. There was a pause in her voice, something careful, measured.
Tony?
Didn't press. Well, it's going to take me a bit to get this up and running again, he said. You can wait inside the shop if you want. There's a fan and some cold water. You look like you could use both. She hesitated, then nodded and introduced herself. Maya, thank you, ... really. Tony smiled. Tony, and you're welcome. Hours passed. Tony worked diligently on the car, while Maya sat in the corner of the small shop, sipping water and occasionally glancing at her phone with increasing nervousness. Something about her didn't add up. She wasn't just worried about being late, she was anxious, like someone holding a secret she couldn't afford to spill. Tony noticed, but said nothing. He'd seen too many people in pain to pry open their wounds. Instead, he talked about small things, how the summers in Elmridge were hotter now, how his daughter moved to the city and hated traffic, how most people thought life here was boring, but he found beauty in its simplicity. Slowly, Maya relaxed. She smiled a few times, even laughed once when Tony joked about his dog being smarter than him. But just when things seemed to soften, her phone buzzed again. This time, her face turned pale. Tony noticed the tremble in her fingers. Everything okay? He asked. She paused too long before replying. Yeah, just ... work stuff. Nodded slowly, sensing there was more. You're welcome to stick around after your car's done. There's a little in nearby. Miss Ethel makes the best peach pie you've ever had. Maya forced a smile. Thanks, but I have to be somewhere. When the car was finally ready, Maya stood and reached into her purse. What do I owe you? Tony wiped his hands and shrugged. Nothing. She blinked. What? You heard me? Consider it a gift. You looked like you needed one. Her voice cracked, but ... why? Because sometimes people don't need another bill. They need a break? Maya stared at him for a long moment, tears welling in her eyes, but she quickly turned away, blinking them back. Thank you, she whispered. Then she drove off. But that wasn't the end. That was just the beginning. 2 weeks later, a black SUV pulled up outside Tony's garage again. This time, it wasn't Maya who stepped out. It was a man in a tailored suit, wearing sunglasses and holding a briefcase. He asked for Tony by name and handed him an envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. It was from Maya. In it, she revealed everything. That day, when Tony helped her, she was on her way to run away from a massive family responsibility. Her father, a powerful CEO, had tried to force her into an arranged business marriage to consolidate wealth. Maya couldn't take it anymore, and decided to flee to start a new life. But something about Tony's kindness changed her. She realized not all people in the world were using others for gain. His selflessness made her reconsider. She turned around, went back to confront her father, and ultimately walked away from the corporate empire, but with dignity, not fear. In the letter, she thanked Tony for being the turning point in her life. And at the bottom of the envelope was a check $500,000 for your garage, for your heart, for your kindness. Tony stood there for a long time, the wind brushing against his worn-out overalls, holding the letter and shaking hands. He didn't care about the money, not really. What touched him was the proof that kindness, the thing he'd been giving away for free all his life, had finally come full circle. But the town of Elmridge, they were in for a surprise, because what Tony did next shocked everyone. Tony stood frozen under the quiet sky of Elmridge, the letter in one hand, the check in the other, and a storm of disbelief building in his chest. The man in the suit who had delivered Maya's message gave a respectful nod, said nothing more, and disappeared into the SUV, leaving behind the kind of silence that felt sacred. For a moment, Tony simply stared at the check, $500,000. It was more money than he had ever seen, more than he'd earned in the last 20 years combined. Not yet. It felt like something deeper than money had just been handed. To him, it felt like a story had been sealed, and another had just begun. Tony didn't cash the check immediately. For 3 days, he kept it locked in a drawer beneath a photo of his late wife, Maria, whose laughter still seemed to echo in the garage walls when the radio played her favorite country songs. He walked through the garage as he always had, fixing carburetors, patching tires, helping old Mr. Jenkins with his stalling Ford, pretending nothing had changed, but inside his mind raced. Not with greed, not with plans of luxury or escape, but with purpose. Because Tony knew something that few ever came to understand. Money doesn't fix everything, but the way it's used can transform lives. And if Maya's letter proved anything, it was that kindness could cause ripples further than anyone imagined. On the 4th morning, Tony walked into Elmridge's only bank, handed over the check, and deposited it with a smile that made the teller young board, usually indifferent, do a double take. What happened next caught the town by surprise. 1 week later, a closed-down mechanic training center on the outskirts of town suddenly had a coming soon banner fluttering. Over its rusted gates, the next week, flyer appeared on every doorstep in Elmridge. Tony's Tools of Hope. Free automotive training and mentorship for at-risk youth and veterans. Word spread like wildfire. People were stunned. Tony, is the humble guy who refused to charge extra for weekend work, starting a school, investing in people. But that wasn't all. The bakery downtown that had been barely surviving Tony paid off its debt anonymously. The community garden project the school kids had started, he bought new tools, a greenhouse, and even hired a local teacher to lead weekend workshops. Still, he never took credit. Just putting a little love back in the engine, he'd say with a wink. But behind the scenes, there was more brewing. Because while Tony was transforming the town with quiet generosity, Maya, far away in the city, was facing her own reckoning. After she had left her family's empire and walked away from the arranged marriage, she had expected to feel free. But the truth was, she felt lost. Her decision had cost her everything: status, financial security, and her father's respect. Yet she held on to one memory: the face of a greasy, kind-hearted man who fixed her car and never asked for anything. The man who reminded her what goodness looked like. So one day, dressed in jeans and a simple sweater, Maya drove herself back to Elmridge. No chauffeur, no agenda, just a heart full of questions. When she pulled into Tony's garage, he looked up from beneath a pickup truck and smiled like he'd been expecting her. "You made it," he said simply. She nodded, tears already forming. "I had to see what you did." Tony stood and wiped his hands, nodding toward the training center. Behind the shop. "Come take a look." What she saw made her gasp. Inside the renovated building were rows of new toolkits, training bays, and a class in session: young men and women. Some fresh out of high school, others with haunted eyes and military tattoos. All learning how to rebuild engines and, in doing so, rebuild their own lives. On the walls hung framed letters from trainees thanking Tony for giving them purpose. Maya walked through in silence, overwhelmed. When they stepped outside, she whispered, "You turned my escape into something real, into something bigger." Tony shook his head. "You did?" It reminded me that kindness can wake people up, heaving those lost in their own lives. But the real shock came the next day. At the town's monthly assembly, usually a sleepy affair where Mrs. Clover talked about recycling bin stone, walked to the front of the hall with Maya beside him, and made an announcement that left the room gasping. "We're starting a community. Repair Cope," he said. "Free car repairs for families in need, and Maya here, well, she's going to help run it." Maya smiled and murmurs spread, some skeptical, some amazed, all curious. Over the next months, Elmridge became something no one expected. News outlets began to visit, curious about how a dying town had suddenly become a hub of generosity and skill building. The mechanic's miracle, they called it. Maya, once fleeing from responsibility, now coordinated donations, hired staff, and even brought in counselors for the veterans enrolled in the program. She rented a small cottage near the river and began speaking at events about value over vanity. Tony. He never changed. He still worked in the garage, still drank gas station coffee, still told awful puns while fixing transmissions. But when people looked at him now, they saw more than a mechanic. They saw a man who ignited a movement with a wrench and a heart too big to measure. Yet the story didn't end there. One cold winter evening, as the sun dipped below the hills and snow began to dust the town, Maya stood beside Tony, looking at the twinkling lights of the newly opened children's shelter funded by the growing Cope and named Maria's Haven. In honor of Tony's wife, she turned to him, voice trembling. "What if I'd never broken down that day?" Tony smiled, eyes wet.
Hey.
"Then maybe someone else would have helped you. Or maybe fate just needed a flat tire to get our engines running." They laughed quietly, and for the first time in years, Maya felt found. Not because of wealth, not because of rebellion, but because of a stranger's kindness that had cracked her armor wide open. Elmridge became a symbol, but more than that, Tit became a beacon. And every time someone asked, "How did all this begin?" the answer was always the same. It started with a mechanic, and a moment of kindness that uncovered everything.